My intention here is to take a step back from the technical content and provide some big picture context for how we use this type of work and how it fits into the regulatory landscape. With that said, I wanted to kick it off with an appreciation for where we started as a field and what we have become today. Dating all the way back to Da Vinci, and many would refer to as the first of the biomedical engineers, we have steadily evolved as a field as more and more tools and resources were developed and at our disposal. Starting back with the use of gross anatomy in cadaver labs, to the development of many benchtop techniques that we use today, and eventually high fidelity imaging techniques like SEM. Even now that evolution continues. I'd say that the modern biomedical engineer is one that has an appreciation for the state of multiplicity. What I mean by that is that to be successful in this field and really push it forward, we have to leverage all of the tools and resources at our disposal. First of all, while we still thirst for more power, we have more computing power in our pockets than we did at all of NASA headquarters when we landed on the moon. Also, more than ever before, we have an appreciation for scale. In biology, we have an appreciation and understanding of what happens on the molecular level, how cells interact with one another, how all of these cells make up an organ, and how organs make up systems in the body. Importantly, we are now gaining an appreciation for how all of these systems interact with one another. We also have much more data to process and pore over. From genomics to advanced imaging techniques, we have the ability to really build a comprehensive narrative to describe a given subject of interest you may be studying. And of course, thanks to software partners like COMSOL, we are increasingly able to account for the multiple types of physics at play in a given subject of interest related to the human body. All of this together feeds into something that I'm sure is obvious to everyone at this event today, but the value proposition of computational modeling and simulation in biomedical engineering is as strong as it ever has been before. We can conduct exponentially more computations per dollar spent than ever before, and these hardware resources feed into a symbiotic machinery that is the relationship between computational modeling, biology, and innovative technology. And each of these components work to build, produce new insights, new technology, and new software for people like us to continue to use. Now, I'm clearly an optimist when it comes to the future of computational modeling in our field, but the clear challenge ahead of us is learning how to effectively use modeling and simulation in support of medical devices to eventually help them be approved by the powers that be. As you know, that the powers that be in the US is the Food and Drug Administration. And while medical device regulators across the world are all technically competent and different in their own right, in my opinion, the technical rigor required to achieve approval by the US FDA is at least as high, if not higher, than other regulatory agencies across the world. Now, to walk through a high-level history of the US FDA's relationship with computational modeling and simulation, I must point out that 2008 is by no means the start of that relationship. But I would say that the workshops that came out of the FDA Critical Path initiatives in 2008 were among the first outward-facing efforts put together by the FDA to promote the use of modeling and simulation. After that, the FDA organized a round robin for modeling studies specifically related to hemolysis and blood damage. But I'd say that the next most important event was the development of the virtual family by IDIS in collaboration with the FDA. As I'm sure many of you are familiar with at this point, this is a virtual family of models that have effectively become the gold standard for representative models used to run electromagnetic, thermal, acoustic, and CFD simulations to mimic physiology inside the human body. Beyond that, in 2016, the guidance on how to report out computational modeling and simulation studies was issued to help standardize the way in which we present these data. This guidance gives us a lot more confidence of how to include modeling and simulation studies in regulatory submissions, since we now have a definitive answer as to what they're looking for when they review these submissions. Finally, in 2018, even though this is an effort that was conducted by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and not the FDA, I think it's important to recognize the significance of the release of the VNB 40 document in 2018. as it provides us comprehensive guidance on approaching verification and validation. Flash forward to today, despite the huge detour we've all taken over the last 12 to 18 months, the development of computational modeling tools and applications is growing as fast as ever. In fact, I want to make a quick plug for the subcommittee ASME VVUQ meeting coming up here this Tuesday. It's open to anyone that's interested, so hope to see a lot of these faces there. But my intention for the rest of the discussion today is to highlight how we can use computational modeling to help bolster our medical device development process and eventually help increase the likelihood that we can eventually bring these devices safely and effectively to market. As we discussed earlier today, many people tend to ask us, when is it appropriate to introduce modeling and simulation to the product development process? Again, as I'm the optimist, my first reaction is to say, modeling and simulation is the answer to everything, whether it be how thin we can make the struts of a nitinol stent graft, to what color we can make the packaging label. I believe there's a model for that. In all seriousness, we have to start thinking of modeling and simulation as a tool in our tool belt that has its strengths and weaknesses. With that said, depending on the type of product you're developing and the specific technical hurdle in front of you, modeling and simulation may well be the answer. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to walk through some examples of how we can use it in our process, using the conceptualization, preclinical, clinical, and commercial use phases as representative examples. We'll then close by addressing the dark cloud hanging over every simulation engineer's head, and that is the importance of verification and validation, a common theme here today. So as a first example, we start at the beginning of the process with the concept phase. I like to think of this phase as the moment after the apple fell on Isaac Newton's head, where he probably asked himself, I have this crazy idea, but could it actually work? No matter what your idea or product is, let's say you're developing an n-dimensional widget, it's quite likely that since interact with one another framework, if you develop your framework in an efficient manner, it's relatively easy to explore the trade-offs of these dimensions with regard to the intended function or performance of your device. Another advantage of physical prototyping is expensive. The fact is slightly alleviated by the presence of rapid prototyping techniques like 3D printing. But the truth is that it's in our best interest to do as much data collection on the front end as possible before investing resources into actual physical prototyping. Parameterization in a simulation framework gives you the unique advantage of extrinsicy in that case. Finally, I'd suggest that the concept phase is the perfect time to ask the questions that you may not be asked. This device may satisfy your functional requirements on a local level, but what are the global implications of it? If we take as an example an aortic valve replacement, not only do we need to know how it opens and closes when it's supposed to, but we need to know what the downstream hemodynamics are. How does it affect the risk of a valve? How does it affect the left ventricular myocardium? Does it increase the stimulus of myocardial reneuron down the road in clinical trials, or even worse after it's been already brought to marketplace? The preclinical phase is where you might say to yourself, this crazy idea might just work. How can I prove it's safe and effective? And that's just the type of question that the FDA is going to be looking for you to answer during this phase. This is especially true when you're submitting applications for investigational device exemptions or 510(k) submissions. Modeling and simulation can actually be quite effective here because of some of the inherent advantages. One such advantage is that it is much easier to replicate in vivo loading conditions here than it is to do on a benchtop. This is particularly true for unique examples with lesser defined benchtop methods, such as occluder devices or other devices with irregular tractions that can be applied to it. Another important use case for modeling and simulation is for those tests that you actually know you're going to eventually have to do benchtop testing for. If you have a particularly large catalog of devices that you know are going to require testing, you can drastically cut down the number of physical experimental tests that you have to run if you can identify worst case using computational and modeling methods. Since this phase is probably the most common that people deploy modeling and simulation in, I wanted to bring in a few specific examples. First, I'm going to highlight a few different applications related to structural mechanics, both of which we at Exponent have been performing for our clients with some regularity. The first of which is a nitinol stent graft. These devices are quite interesting due to how complex they are from a structural and material standpoint, and how they are generally very small. The advantage of computational modeling in this case is the spatial discretization of the information we can derive. You can, for instance, derive stresses into very small nooks and crannies of these nitinol frames. Another more common example is the evaluation of femoral stems for either quasi-static or cyclic loading. The example I'm sharing here today is actually quite interesting because it's an example that was used in support of a 510K submission dating all the way back to 1990. For that particular application, no experimental data was issued, and the device was actually approved solely on the merits of the results provided from the computational models. So a unique example in that it dates all the way back to 1990, and that it was, successfully used for a 510K submission. On the CFD side of the house, the obvious example that comes to mind is that of hemodynamics. Depending on where you are in the circulatory loop, you can experience vastly different hemodynamics. For example, in the aortic artery, you see pulsatile and turbulent flow with the venous or laminar flow with the shown here is an example of a bileaflet. Particular interest in this case is whether or not there are stagnation that are characterized. On the right, much like the presentation we just heard of damage or hemolysis model. Here, we've included a representative example of a left ventricular assist device. As you can imagine, as we just heard, blood trauma and hemolysis is a significant area of concern. And while there are experimental methods of addressing this, coupling that with the element. Finally, for this phase, I'd like to allude to like I alluded to in the panel discussion earlier, and was gone into in much greater depth in David's talk right afterwards, the preclinical evaluation of MRI compatibility for both passive and active implantable medical devices is of increasingly significant interest to medical device companies and regulators alike. While there are a number of risks that must be accounted for regarding the interaction between the device, the electromagnetic field, and the body, one of the most complicated of those risks is that of radiofrequency-induced heating. With a properly validated and verified simulation framework, we can perform comparative or even predictive studies of RF-induced heating. This is particularly interesting in what would be referred to as multi-configuration passive devices. Take, for example, a line of hip prostheses. A manufacturer may be seeking compatibility information on their entire catalog, but this is complicated by the fact that all of their components, let's say the stems, the heads, the shells, the screws, the liners, they're all cross-compatible. So you have millions of different combinations to account for. The use of computational modeling and simulation, coupled with statistical modeling, can allow you to pare down the number of experimental tests that you have to perform eventually. And then furthermore, modeling and simulation allows us to really bridge the gap between the experimental test, which is well characterized and defined in the relevant standards, and the eventual clinical use case. For that, we can rely on detailed anatomical models of the human body and how the electromagnetic field propagates through these heterogeneous tissues. Moving on to the clinical phase, at this point, you're telling yourself, all right, now let's prove that this is safe and effective in humans. What's critical to appreciate here is that clinical trials are expensive. Depending on the complexity of the device and the uniqueness, those trials can run between $30 million and $100 million. And that's if everything goes to plan. The benefit of modeling and simulation in this case is that we can maximize the return on investment in clinical trials. Depending on what your study is, it's quite likely that you're collecting some sort of imaging data during it, whether it be MRI, CT, or ultrasound. We can ultimately use that imaging data to recreate patient-specific models of the anatomy and its interaction with the device in question. At the end of the day, you've furthered your insight and you've gotten more out of the dollars spent on that initial capital investment for the clinical trial. For my final example, we're going to jump all the way to the commercial use phase, where we have to ask the question, how do we make sure we stay on top of the changing needs for this device? Once you've brought the device to the marketplace, you drastically increase the number of data points you had regarding the efficacy of the device in vivo. Throughout the course of post-market evaluation, you may consider making some changes to that device to improve on it. Or in another case, you may be motivated to add a new group of size offerings for a particular device. Modeling and simulation could theoretically be used in both of these cases to address concerns that you've either introduced new risk factors that were not addressed in the original submission, or even better, that you've improved upon the performance of your device. Finally, in the case that you observe some sort of failure modality in your device through commercial use, you can use modeling and simulation to perform a thorough root cause analysis and evaluate, if you have to, patency of litigation claims filed against your company regarding your device. While we all obviously want to avoid this process altogether, I hope this has opened your eyes to how you can use computational modeling and simulation throughout the product development lifecycle, no matter where you are in the process with your particular device. Before wrapping up my talk here today, I promised we'd rehash the importance of verification and validation. It certainly has turned to be a bit of a theme here today, so I do apologize for that, but so this may not necessarily be any news to you, but I want to set the stage with an explanation of why it's important. For starters, medical device development is a highly regulated industry, as you all know. It may seem overly burdensome at times, but we all have to take a step back and appreciate the intention of these regulations, and that is that they're ultimately trying to drive patient safety and patient health. Furthermore, biological variability from patient to patient is extremely high. When it comes to biological modeling, there is no such thing as one size fits all. Biomedical modeling is also unique in that we have to create unique solutions to how we come about verification and validation. For starters, there's no such thing as a model that's validated or not validated. There's a spectrum, and that's related to the biological and situational variability we've already alluded to. Furthermore, since it's not often feasible to perform verification and validation off of actual in vivo or clinical data, we often have to rely on semi-quantitative comparators and results derived from imaging studies. Finally, up until recently, the use of modeling in our field has lagged behind that in other industries, let's say aerospace as an example, because of a lack of guidance of how to perform verification and validation, and the uncertainty of how it would be received by regulatory bodies. With that said, the sad news is that, like it or not, your models are not inherently credible. Establishing credibility of your model requires, at the very least, careful consideration into verification and validation. As a start, I'll echo what Carlos said on the panel earlier. Once we have definition that we can establish as our foundation, we can build. With that said, verification is the process of determining that a computational model accurately represents the underlying mathematical model and its solution. In other words, are the equations being solved for correctly? Validation is the process of determining the degree to which a model is an accurate representation of the real world. In other words, are the correct equations being solved for? When we think of these things, I'm sure we're all asking ourselves, do we really have to go through this much effort for this particular device? How much is enough for this particular device? Fortunate for us, BNV40 has allowed us to take a huge step forward in addressing those questions. For those that are less familiar, and I'm sure most of you are familiar at this point, I thought I'd spend some time going through the framework that BNV40 has provided us with, a risk-informed credibility assessment. So we start off with a question of interest. What are we trying to answer with our model? From there, we define the context of use. How are we going to use that model to answer that question? Then we gain an appreciation for the risk. How much influence does this model have, and what would happen if this model goes wrong? From there, how much risk can we tolerate? Given the risk, how credible does that model need to be? Taking these things into account, we plan a verification and validation activity, we execute it. When we look at the results, what does it tell us about the model's credibility? Is it enough for our context of use? If the answer is yes, then we move on to documentation evidence, and we have a nice little bottle of champagne and celebrate our submission. If not, we go back to the beginning and we revisit our context of use, revisit how we've set up the model, and then go through the process over again. With an understanding of how the framework is supposed to work, let's walk through a hypothetical example of what may not be the best approach to verification and validation. I'll be the first to admit I've certainly fallen into this fallacy before. So we start off with a quote-unquote comprehensive literature review. In other words, a few keywords thrown into PubMed. You find a scientific paper, you develop a model that matches that paper, and you get some sort of agreement between your model and the published data. You then check the box off in your head and say you now have a validated, verified model, you're good to go. You then proceed to make significant changes to the boundary conditions and assumptions in your model, and eventually that model gets used for decision-making purposes. The question we should all be asking ourselves is, how do we know that these alterations have not significantly changed the confidence we have in our results? It's a very important question that we all need to be looking at. Without belaboring the point, here's an example of best practices for analyzing your verification and validation approach. We take as a foundation reference data points shown here with x1 and x2 on the graph axes. The closer your context of use is to the reference points, the more confidence you have in your modeling results. For instance, in context of use 1, you're very close to the reference points, and this instills a high degree of confidence in your data, while we have much less confidence in the context of use 3. But you may not only have to consider your confidence in the data when it comes to addressing if it's acceptable or not. The model influence and the consequences of your error in your model also have to be accounted for. As a specific example here, while we have a medium degree of confidence in context of use 2, the red one shown here, the amount of risk associated with that model renders those results virtually unacceptable. These are the types of questions you need to be asking yourself when it comes to approaching verification and validation. And then finally, I'll end by reminding you that verification and validation 40 does not tell us how to perform V&V. Rather, it gives us a framework by which to decide on a plan. And that plan is ultimately decided on by the manufacturer. Given the case-to-case variability that comes into place when determining the specific how-tos for your case, it's certainly in your best interest to leverage pre-submission interaction with the FDA and other regulatory bodies. For instance, tell them what your context of use is. Tell them how you plan on approaching V&V. Tell them how you plan to account for uncertainty associated with your prediction. The feedback that you get in this phase could prove to be a huge saver in terms of both time and money down the road. And then I'll close with just a few summary points. The value of computational modeling and simulation continues to grow on a daily basis, and it can slot into any part of the product development lifecycle. To keep pushing this forward, this relies on the efforts of everyone here on the phone and everyone in this industry to keep doing the good work that we're doing. And then finally, the most obvious of all, verification and validation must be given careful consideration, and it's something that is too often ignored. With that said, I want to thank you all for your time. You can see my contact information here if you want to reach out to me via email, phone, or LinkedIn is certainly appropriate. I do want to provide a quick plug for Exponent. We are an engineering and sciences technical consulting firm. We operate in all sectors from oil and gas to civil engineering to the medical device space. Regarding the medical device industry, you can see here our flagship services. They go well beyond the scope of what I've addressed here today. If you have any questions, I invite you to reach out, whether it be regarding this specific talk or any questions you have about our services. We're happy to answer any questions you may have.